Good morning, everyone. I, Nishant Kumar of Group 7C, would like to present you the glimpse about the research that our group has done about the economy of Germany. As we all are aware, that Germany is one of the largest economies in Europe and third largest in the world, having a vast industrial base, focused on export-oriented growth and fiscal discipline. Germany went through numerous ups and downs in the history, like being divided into two separate nations, facing economic crisis, unemployment, then reunification happened, and in the current years, 2008 crisis and the pandemic are some examples. The country's government took some astounding decisions and helped the country came out of all the phases. In this particular report, we will look into some factors that affect the economy of Germany, such as GDP, fiscal policies, unemployment, and inflation through a period of 3 decades, starting from 1990 to 2024. Starting with the GDP, let's understand what GDP actually is. It refers to the monetary valuation of all goods and services produced in the country. If we talk about the trend here, starting the decade in 1990, it was a problematic decade where after the unification, economy tried to stabilize a bit with slower growth, which also set a solid groundwork for stability in future. But just after 1995, it started dwindling a downward turn. Reasons being high infrastructure costs and unemployment in east regions. But the next decade turned out to be somewhat favorable for Germany, as in the beginning of 2000s, it got some inertia and started growing due to the structural reforms in labor markets that encourage export-driven industrial foundation. Also, because of these reforms, Germany was one of the first few countries to get out of the 2008 financial crisis. Since 2010, Germany saw a steady growth and reached $3.8 trillion, dollars, supported by high export and robust manufacturing. However, at the end of the decade, COVID-19 happened and everything came to a full stop. The upcoming decade of 2020 saw many more new challenges, like the war that broke between Ukraine and Russia, which hit Germany really hard, as they totally depended on Russia's natural gas. 2024, GDP grew at 1.4% annually. Here you can see the graph that depicts the GDP over the following years that we discussed. Talking about the fiscal policy, which talks about taxation, public spending, and borrowing to impact the country, Germany in the starting launched a balanced budget policy, which they called as Choice Null. In 1990, trying to integrate eastern part with the rest of the country, they increased public spending on infrastructure development and social transfers, which resulted in rising deficits, making their debt to GDP ratio almost 60% at the end of the decade. In 2000s, Germany chose to unravel from the rest of EU. Stability and Growth Pact reforms and spending cuts were introduced to reduce their growing deficit. 2008's crisis marked temporary transition into expansionary fiscal regimes, and at the end of 2010, government returned to fiscal responsibility, stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio. The upcoming decade of 2010 to 2020 saw strong economic growth and compliance, where in 2012 their net borrowing was minus 0.05%, closing to balanced budget. The decade saw surplus with good exports and low unemployment, maintaining financial stability, while the upcoming years of 2020 till 2024 turned disastrous for Germany as they were entangled with post-pandemic crisis. The war, which cut their natural gas supplies from Russia, strained the German economy. But the government has measures and geared them towards sustaining financial finances while handling energy and inflation problems. The government are also shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which was also part of their fiscal policy. Here you can see the graph which represents how these policies affected the economy. Our next factor is unemployment, which is defined by the portion of the labor force which actively seeks work. Unemployment in Germany was at 6.2% at the start of the decade and it rose till 9.7% in 1997 due to the merger of East Germany, which was because of increased restructuring of industries, competition, and productivity lagging in eastern states. In the decade of 2000s, unemployment rose at its highest ever, peaking at 11% in 2005. Due to stagnant economic growth, Hartz reforms were implemented to reduce unemployment, which was also affected by 2008 financial crisis. At the end of the decade, unemployment shrunk till 6.6%. From 2010 to 2020, Germany saw a continuous decline in unemployment rate till 3% in 2019, which were the result of adequate manufacturing capability and overseas demand for German produce. But due to the pandemic in 2020, unemployment saw a slightly rise, making at 3.6% of the population, caused by disruption in the business and global supply chain. Germany desperately made recovery efforts in stabilizing unemployment, where a lot of factors were not in their favor. Unemployment rate stood at 3.4% in 2024. Here, by the help of the graph, you can understand the trend. Our last factor in deciding the economic turmoil is the inflation rate, which is simple words is the price of different goods and services rise over the period of time. Talking about the trend since 1990s, inflation was modest, averaging between 2.7% to 3.5%. At the end of the decade, inflation dropped further till 0.6%. Upcoming decade of 2000 saw a stable inflation rate around 1.5%, and when 2008 crisis hit, plummeted to 0.2%. The 2010 till 2020 saw some ups and downs in inflation rate, where average was 1.5%. For the decade, it hit lowest in 2015 at 0.4%, then highest in 2019 at 1.9% due to the pandemic. But from 2020 to 2024, Germany saw a hike in inflation rate caused by the pandemic and war disruptions, and it reached all-time high at 8.7% in 2022. But it started falling down and reached 2.4% in 2024. Graph shows the inflation rate over the years. We can conclude from 1990 to 2024, German economy showed resilience and adaptability and faced challenges which were disruptive enough to shake the economy. But due to the policies and decisions taken by the government, helped the economy to bounce back and perform better. GDP growth can be understood by their strong industrial base, fiscal discipline by the Black Zero policy, enabling long term stability, unemployment controlled by structural reforms, helping even in the recent shocks, and inflation remained mostly stable, only hiking post pandemic, and got controlled within a span of 2 years. The fiscal conservatism and flexibility of Germany have ensured stability and made it possible for the country to establish itself as Europe's economic leader even in the worst of times. And that's all. Thank you. And these are some of the references that we used for the research.